I am a very old man. How old, I do not know. Possibly I am 100, possibly more, but I cannot tell because I have never aged as other men, nor do I remember any childhood. So far as I can recollect, I have always been a man of about 30. I appear today as I did 40 years and more ago, and yet I feel that I cannot go on living forever, that some day I shall die the real death from which there is no resurrection. I do not know why I should fear death, I who have died twice and am still alive, but yet I have the same horror of it as you who have never died, and it is because of this terror of death, I believe, that I am so convinced of my mortality. And because of this conviction, I have determined to write down the story of the interesting periods of my life and of my death. I cannot explain the phenomena. I can only set down here in the words of an ordinary soldier of fortune a chronicle of the strange events that befell me during the 10 years that my dead body lay undiscovered in an Arizona cave. I have never told this story, nor shall mortal man see this manuscript until after I have passed over for eternity. I know that the average human mind will not believe what it cannot grasp, and so I do not purpose being pilloried by the public, the pulpit, and the press, and held up as a colossal liar when I am but telling the simple truths which someday science will substantiate. Possibly the suggestions which I gained upon Mars and the knowledge which I can set down in this chronicle will aid in an earlier understanding of the mysteries of our sister planet. Mysteries to you, but no longer mysteries to me. Hello and welcome, or welcome back, as the case may be, to the Atlantean Archive. Glad you stopped by. Wanted to talk to you for a few minutes today about one of the most influential science fiction fantasy novels ever written. That is A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is the first book in what is known as the Mars series, Burroughs' Mars series, also sometimes called the John Carter series or John Carter of Mars series, named for the main character in the stories, the protagonist there, John Carter of Virginia, the ex-Confederate soldier who is adventuring out west. He's hunted by the Apaches, finds himself in a cave, and then is mysteriously transported to Mars, where he has all sorts of adventures. It's also known sometimes as the Barsoom series. In these novels, Barsoom is what the Martians call their planet, so that's sometimes known by that name. Now, for some reason, when I was growing up, I never read Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I say that now to my shame. I was reading guys like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. I think The War of the Worlds, as a matter of fact, was probably the first unabridged adult science fiction novel that I ever read. But as much as I was reading back then and reading men like that who were writing in more or less the same era, I never came across Burroughs' material. I don't remember seeing any of his books in our school libraries, which is a shame. I don't remember any of my friends reading those books at the time who could have passed them off to me and said, hey, man, you need to read this. I think my dad and his brother had read some of the Tarzan stories growing up. And I remember seeing the old black and white Tarzan movies on TV that came on a lot, especially during the weekends when I was a kid. But I had never actually read any of his books. And over the last couple of years, I've been getting back more heavily into science fiction, watching a lot of BookTube especially, and all the BookTube reviewers who are into sci-fi at one point or another came back to Burroughs and talking about how influential he was, has been in the genre, and especially the Mars series. So I finally decided, I got to fix this. I got to read Burroughs. So picked up A Princess of Mars, and it's just been one of the best experiences I've had reading in 2023. Highly recommend this book. If you love science fiction, especially vintage science fiction, especially pulp science fiction, if you are into Robert E. Howard, for instance, I think you'll really enjoy the John Carter series, the Mars series. When I was reading this, I immediately began to notice similarities between Howard's writing, especially the way he writes action sequences, that sort of thing, the way he describes John Carter, the kind of hero that he is. I noticed a lot of similarities between those elements and aspects of Robert E. Howard's writing. The way that Howard writes action sequences, his characters, especially of Cull and even more Solomon Kane, they mirror the character traits of John Carter in various ways. And I did some research on that because I figured, okay, this can't be coincidence. Robert E. Howard had to have been reading Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I found out that that was indeed the case. As a matter of fact, after he died, Robert E. Howard's father donated the books in his library, and among the books that were donated were a number of Edgar Rice Burroughs books, his Tarzan series and the Mars series. So, yeah, he was reading Edgar Rice Burroughs, and it's obvious that he was very much influenced by it. The John Carter series here, it's very much a Western set in space. Westerns were really popular at the time that this was written. It was written in 1911 originally, and it was serialized beginning in 1912 in the All Story magazine, a magazine similar to what Weird Tales would eventually become. Again, Westerns real popular at that time. Zane Grey was writing, and that's kind of what the public was into. Of course, Robert E. Howard and other writers later on would also jump on that bandwagon with their own Western stories. And in a lot of ways, the Western genre, maybe starting with A Princess of Mars, I guess, has been heavily influenced by Westerns. I think Gene Roddenberry referred to Star Trek originally as a kind of wagon train to the stars concept. Those of you who are Firefly fans will immediately make that connection. Malcolm Reynolds, as a matter of fact, the captain of the Serenity in Firefly, is very similar to John Carter. He's not a dead ringer, but I think there's some obvious influence there. Carter, the ex-Confederate soldier, he's fought on the losing side of a civil war. Then he goes out west and tries his luck there, ends up fighting the natives. Malcolm Reynolds, he's fighting with the independent planets. They're defeated, and then he spends his time trying to stay away from the Alliance. He goes out west, as it were, and of course, there's a lot of Western trappings in Firefly with all of those independent systems that are far out from the Alliance planets. So I would say that that's definite there. I haven't looked at what Joss Whedon has said, if he attributes Edgar Rice Burroughs as having been an influence, but to me it seems like it definitely is an influence. Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers were both directly taken from John Carter. The Mars series has also been influential in, as I mentioned, Star Trek, the idea of the wagon train to the stars. Captain Kirk is in many ways a kind of a John Carter. He embodies a lot of the same characteristics that John Carter has and finds himself in similar situations. And then in Star Wars, there are a lot of elements that come from the Mars series. George Lucas has been influenced by that. As a matter of fact, I think if you were to take John Carter and split him in half, you would end up with Luke Skywalker and Han Solo. And Princess Leia is not a dead ringer for Deja Thoris, John Carter's love interest from the Mars series, but she's pretty darn close in a lot of ways. And again, you have the Western elements there. So the influence is all over the place. Other science fiction writers, Bradbury was influenced by Burroughs, his own Mars books. He were influenced by that. Carl Sagan, from what I remember, had a map of Barsoom outside of his office for a number of years. He was influenced by that. This is another example. People try to say that things like science fiction and fantasy, and especially horror, are just a waste of time. But they fail to realize just how much this stuff stimulates the imagination, how much it gets people thinking about possibilities, and it gets them trying to push the envelope in their own areas of life, and it inspires them to get into more and more avenues that maybe they wouldn't investigate otherwise. I know that all of the cast of Star Trek have talked about how many letters they had received from people in the past who had been influenced by seeing them on television and went on to profitable roles in life and started doing their own research and getting into the sciences themselves. James Doohan, who played Scotty in Star Trek, mentioned that on a number of occasions, that he got letters from people that had gone into engineering specifically because Scotty inspired them. So you get all sorts of inspiration that comes from stories like this. And this is arguably the grandfather of them all. Now, as I mentioned, Edgar Rice Burroughs began writing these stories in 1911. And it's kind of funny when you look into the background of this, because he was embarrassed by it. He thought, he was reading Pulp Fiction at the time, and from what I understand, there's a couple different variations of this quote. But he said something to the effect of, I can do at least that bad, and decided to try his hand at writing this kind of material. He was not a financial success prior to this. None of his business dealings were getting him anywhere. He had mouths to feed, and he seemed to be getting kind of desperate. So he decided to give this a try. Started kicking around story ideas for what eventually became A Princess of Mars, although he hadn't worked out that title at the time. But he kept it to himself. He did tell his wife about what he was working on, but the whole thing seemed kind of childish to him, kind of immature. He was afraid that People, if they realized what he was writing and they read this, that they would think he was off his rocker, or that he was being childish himself and off in a fantasy land, doing things that aren't appropriate for an adult man to be doing. Again, the idea there, science fiction, not serious literature. A lot of people have that idea even now, but even more so back then. I think sci-fi is at least more accepted today. It's taken more seriously because it saturates our entertainment culture. But back then, yeah, he was concerned about that. He thought that maybe anybody he had business dealings with in the future would say, no, we're not going to work with the crazy guy. So he wrote these stories kind of on the lowdown, and he wrote them under a pen name at the time. He called it Normal Bean is the name that he used for the author of the stories. Just trying to say, hey, look, I'm a normal guy. I'm harmless. I'm not crazy or anything like that. And it's kind of funny, when it went to publication, it was serialized in a magazine called the All Story magazine, similar to what Weird Tales would eventually become. And when they went to do the typesetting on it, whoever was doing that mistook Normal Bean for Norman Bean. So that's what they ended up publishing the story under. And it was, again, it was serialized in the magazine. And you can see that in the style, in the writing style in the book. The chapters typically end with some kind of a cliffhanger. Somebody's in danger, somebody's got to be rescued, there's a battle about to be fought, something like that. Some kind of an ending that would get readers coming back for the next issue. Those cliffhanger endings that I always hated when I was watching stuff as a kid. Because back then, you were watching a show like Superman, you didn't get another episode until next week. So you had to wait all that time to find out what happened to Superman and Lois Lane. But you could see that kind of influence in the book. And finally, it was serialized in 1912, and then it was published finally as a novel, a complete novel, including some material that the magazine publisher had asked Burroughs to omit because they didn't think it was very interesting. Some background material. All of that was put together, and it was released as A Princess of Mars finally in 1917. And the rest, as they say, is history. The stories proved very popular. From what I understand, by about 1914, the reading public really knew who Edgar Rice Burroughs was, and they were all on board with his fiction. He was starting to make money. His whole life began to turn around at that point. So, a great success there. And getting into the story itself, just to give you an idea, it's not a very long read. It's easily doable in certainly a couple of days if you're a slower reader. If you're a real fast reader, you can just go through books like a buzzsaw. You can do it within a day. The writing style is, it's not complicated. There are times when it's very poetic. It is a pulp writing style, but it's good pulp. We'll put it that way. And easily accessible. So it's not something that you're going to have to labor through or get bogged down with a whole lot of laborious description or anything like that. John Carter himself is an interesting character. Again, he's an ex-Confederate soldier. He is a Southern gentleman who goes out west trying to seek adventure out there and finds it. Finds himself again up against the Apache. One of his friends is killed. He's hiding himself in a cave when he more or less falls into a mysterious coma and then ends up with some sort of astral travel situation. He finds himself outside of his body and he's looking down. He's standing there naked with some sort of physical form, but he's looking down at his body, which appears to be dead or asleep on the floor of the cave. He wanders outside. He looks up. He sees Mars, the old god of war, the god of his profession, as he says, burning bright up there in the heavens. And he feels this inexplicable call to Mars. So he reaches out to it, and he finds himself transported across the cold, dark void to the surface of Mars, where he stands on the desert, kind of looking around going, how the heck did this happen? Now, Mars in the Mars series, in the Edgar Rice Burroughs series, is, as many people thought that it probably was at that time, a dying world. The oceans have long since dried up. You've got some rivers. You've got underground water that comes into the story later on, but most of the surface water has disappeared. A lot of the vegetation is gone. It's a desert planet, hot during the day, cold at night, thin atmosphere, lower gravity, which turns out to be to John Carter's advantage. He's pretty much a superhero on Mars, and I think that some of his characteristics in the story translate it later on into the superhero tales in the comics and the stories that we got in the Marvel universe today. I think a lot of that goes back to him. He finds that because he comes from a planet with stronger gravity, he's a much stronger, more flexible than the Martian inhabitants. He's able to knock down the toughest Martian warriors with a single blow. He can, and he's the ideal type of swashbuckling hero from that era. He's a man's man, or what was thought of as a man's man at that time, anyway. He's this tall, good looking guy. He's a capable fighter. He doesn't back down from anything. He's got strong principles. He's willing to stand up for what he believes. He goes to the aid of the defenseless. He's just your ideal type of guy. And he becomes, of course, the prototype of the sci-fi action hero that we all know today in various forms. And he can pretty much master any weapon that he picks up. All of this comes in very handy on Mars. The details of the Martian cultures, there are a number of them, various Martian races, and they all have different skin color. You've got your green Martians who are kind of, they're humanoid, but almost reptilian in a way. They've got 6 arms. They've got tusks, these white tusks. They're entirely green and hairless. They grow up to about 15 feet tall. They have a harsh society, very unloving and unemotional. Those things are discouraged. The men and the women are both warriors. You also have a white race that comes up that looks more like John Carter's people. They come up in the second book in the series, The Gods of Mars, which I'm halfway through now. Then you have the Red Men, which are a primary or a main faction in A Princess of Mars. Dejah Thoris, John Carter's love interest, is one of the red people of Mars. These are entirely humanoid except for their coppery skin. And then you've got, there's a yellow race, there's a black race. These other races come into play in the follow-up books in the series. But in the first book here, A Princess of Mars, you've got mainly the green men and the red men, and then you've got John Carter, who finds himself in the midst of all of this, trying to make peace, trying to fight his way to the top, because Mars being this dying planet, the harsh environment, warriors are highly prized, especially amongst the green race. Another thing about this that made book illustrations a little bit difficult in the past is that basically nobody on Mars wears clothes. They all run around naked, except for the harnesses that they wear for their weapons, various decorations, maybe some ceremonial robes, anything that they wear to designate rank, that sort of thing. Otherwise, they're all running around mother naked. And John Carter, coming from the Old South, seems to adapt rather quickly to that. So a little more quickly than might be believable. Okay, sorry about the skip there. It's one of the hazards of trying to record a video when you've got kids at home. Sometimes stuff happens and you have to be elsewhere in a hurry. So, where was I? John Carter amongst the Green Men. These are a violent, warlike race. They value military prowess above all things. And John Carter, because of his fantastic fighting abilities coming from the higher gravity of Earth, quickly becomes prominent amongst them. He is a prisoner, and somebody's almost always threatening him with death, but he begins to rise in esteem amongst the Green Men anyway, simply because he's such a fantastic fighter. He comes to a leadership position ultimately. He becomes an advisor to the leaders above him. And during this entire time, he's scheming about how to get away from them. It's not clear to him where he's going to go or what he's going to do at that point, but he's looking for opportunities. Then there's a day when the Green Men end up in a battle with one of the Red Kingdoms, the kingdoms of the Red Men of Mars, specifically Helium in this case, and a red Martian woman is captured. This is Dejah Thoris, the princess of the title of the book. She is the princess of the kingdom of Helium, the red Martian kingdom of Helium, and becomes John Carter's love interest. Dejah Thoris, although she's called the original sci-fi pinup girl, is far more than just a pretty face to give John Carter something to fight for in the story. She's unusual for a female character in pulp stories and the sci-fi stories of that era, in that most of the female characters you read in stories back then, or maybe not most, but many of them, were there to scream a lot, get themselves in trouble, and be rescued by the hero. Dejah Thoris, though, she is beautiful, but she is also intelligent. She's a scientist. She is a capable diplomat. She's an excellent speaker. She's able to exercise that diplomacy when she needs to. She's also capable of giving people crap when she wants to. So she can give as well as she gets. John Carter pretty well falls head over heels for her almost immediately. She takes time to warm up to him, partially because John Carter is unfamiliar with the customs on Mars. He doesn't quite know his way around this stuff yet, and what we would call dating or courtship rituals amongst the Martian races. So that's kind of an issue, but ultimately it gets cleared up, and she falls head over heels in love with him as well. At that point in the story, part of John Carter's impetus changes. He's no longer simply interested in escaping the green men of Mars just for his own sake. He wants to return Dejah Thoris to her people. And that serves as the foundation for the rest of the story and the adventures, the mishaps that they get themselves into, and the close shaves. As I mentioned, a lot of these chapters have cliffhanger type endings that take you from one crisis to another until you get to the ultimate resolution. So I really highly recommend this for anybody who likes fiction from that era, especially if you're into that old pulp vintage sci-fi adventure stuff. This is great reading material. Don't look for a lot of scientific accuracy in it. This is not one of those kind of books. This is just where you turn that suspension of disbelief up. But even so, it's a well done book. It's not sloppy with its details or its world building details. It also doesn't get into a whole lot of long periods of exposition. That's one of the strengths that I'm seeing in Edgar Rice Burroughs, at least from this book, which is my first taste of him. I mean, he may do something differently in other books in the series, I don't know. But he doesn't go into long periods of exposition for his world building. Rather, he weaves it into the substance of the story, and it develops naturally as the plot moves from one point to another. And John Carter and Dejah Thoris are trying to get through this world. He just adds one detail after another, and it all flows very naturally. It flows very well. You do get at least one lengthy period of exposition when a green Martian woman tells John Carter about her past, and that becomes some pivotal information that he uses to bring the story to the resolution that Burroughs gives us ultimately. When the book was first being serialized, the editors actually left that out because they thought it would bore the audiences. I don't really know why. To me, it was really fascinating. It was a great bit of world building that he does for us there, but be that as it may. But it still works very well, and I think that's one of the strengths of what Edgar Rice Burroughs does with this story. John Carter himself, again, he's an interesting character. He's that prototypical sci-fi action-adventure hero. And I should mention, as was mentioned in the reading that I did, which is from the very beginning of the book, that portion where John Carter has left a manuscript and his nephew, the narrator of the story, basically the Burroughs figure of the story, we're kind of reading over his shoulder as he's going through his uncle's description of his time on Mars, what's happened to him here. John Carter mentions that he is effectively immortal. He doesn't remember a childhood. He only knows that he's very old, but he doesn't even know how old. And I don't know if this is something that we get an explanation on at some point. I'm deliberately avoiding spoilery information for the rest of the series because I just want to read it and get the experience of going through the story myself. So I don't know if that's something he comes back to and explains or what have you, but that's another aspect of John Carter. He's not just an interesting character for his fighting ability on Mars. He's just an unusual man altogether. So we'll see where that goes. Was there anything I didn't like about the story? Not really. I mean, it's got some pulpy type moments that'll make you smile. Some of the descriptions of John Carter's fighting prowess, that sort of thing. But that's par for the course with this kind of material, and it's definitely not overdone. Burroughs is very, shall we say, conservative in his use of making John Carter into too much of a giant for this. So you don't get that as much as you do in some other stories. But that is a little bit of an element there that some people might not take seriously. But then again, if you know what you're reading from the outset, you're kind of prepared for that. There is one aspect of John Carter's character that did surprise me that seems negative. You've got this old Southern gentleman here. He's got a pretty strong ruthless streak in him, though. Don't come between John Carter and his woman. And for those of you who don't want any spoilers, you want to read the story for yourself, and you don't want to be spoiled on certain details, you might want to tune out now. Thank you for watching to this point. But for those of you who have read it, I'd be interested in your feedback on this. John Carter betrays a group of the Red Martian men who take him in and make him a leader and put him in a position of trust. He immediately, as he finds himself in that situation, is automatically thinking about how he can betray them and overthrow them because they are at war with the people of Helium. And of course, he's trying to get his princess back to Helium safely. So even though they take him in and they trust him and are willing to turn their backs on him, he lays them low and works together, of course, with the Green Race to bring this huge army into the city and end up overthrowing it and kills a whole lot of people in the process. So I'm reading this going, dang, that's cold. I mean, he's just ruthless. He looks, Han Solo had that shoot first, ask questions later approach, but John Carter is just in another league at this point. He's willing to destroy an entire city, an entire kingdom of the Red Martians to get his woman back to safety. So that was an interesting aspect that I was not expecting. Burroughs built a little bit more character into him than I was expecting. He's not just this squeaky clean type character with the ironclad set of principles. He's willing to lay a body count out when his woman's safety is concerned. So that was an interesting aspect of it. But again, let me know what you think. So that's my take on A Princess of Mars. Getting into this series, one of the best finds I've come across in a long time. Thank you to all those who recommended it. For those of you who want to know more about Edgar Rice Burroughs, I recommend Michael K. Vaughan's channel. He's a big Burroughs fan. He's read all of his books, knows a whole lot more about him and his material than I do. And he's fascinating to listen to as he gets into the details on this stuff, so you might want to check him out. But I look forward to reading the rest of this series. So thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please do give it a like. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Please share the content as you see fit with anybody that you'd like to annoy. And until next time, God bless and happy reading.